Hello everyone, welcome to the Virtual Forum on Philosophy on our BJA channel. Today we will discuss an important aspect of Japanese culture. If you are involved with the business in Japan or working with Japanese companies or for the Japanese customers, this topic is very important. We will talk about sake, or what Japanese speakers call Nihonshu in this episode. Now the term sake in Japanese language refers to any alcoholic drinks. So if you're talking about the national treasure of Belgium, beers, or the Anglophone pride, whiskey or scotch, or the Francophone culinary necessity, wine, they are all considered to be sake in Japanese. If we are referring to the Japanese drink by the term sake in front of your clients in Japan, it might be good to put an adjective before it by saying Japanese sake, or simply use the Japanese term Nihonshu. Nihonshu or Japanese sake is a traditional alcohol beverage made out of rice, water, and a type of fungi or kind of mold called koji. The scientific name of this organism is called Aspergillus oryzae. Trust me, I had to check how to pronounce this word and practice many times before this video. It's a lot easier to call it Nihon Kojikabi or simply koji. What is important to remember here is that this koji is used for the fermentation process necessary for creating Japanese sake, in addition to other signature ingredients in Japanese traditional dishes like miso and soy sauce. Here's a small fun fact for the lovers of Japan and Belgium. If you have been to the Embassy of Belgium in Tokyo, you know the closest station to the embassy. Yes, it is Kojimachi Station in Tokyo Metro Yurakucho line. The term machi means town in Japanese. Thus, Kojimachi means the town in which koji was produced. It could also mean that the miso was produced in that specific part of the city as well. Anyway, it's symbolically a great gesture to locate an embassy in a town called Kojimachi if you are going to say that the Belgian culture will be integral to the formation of Japanese culture, right? So, how can we introduce Nihonshu and its relation to Japanese culture? We have decided to do the following two things in this channel for the BJA members. First, we are going to refer to a famous book on Japanese sake and introduce it as a kind of the standard knowledge that we could expect from anyone who is familiar with the Japanese culture. Second, and this is the most exciting part, we are going to interview sommeliers of Japanese sake from two companies in Belgium that import Nihonshu for the customers in Europe. These two companies are called Kanpai and Omai Sake, and we will have a chance to talk to their Japanese sake experts. Now, it is too much to cover both in one episode, and especially since we would like to keep each episode as a short clip that you can watch or listen during your commuting or during your lunch break, we will briefly explain sake and its relation to Japanese culture in the rest of this episode, and then interview the experts in the next episode. The famous book on Japanese sake is called Nihon no Sake, which literally means Japanese sake. How original. This book was first published in 1964 by a renowned specialist of agricultural chemistry in Japan, and his name is Sakaguchi Kenichiro, and this is how he looks. Sakaguchi was the leading researcher of enzymes in the last century, but most known among Japanese intellectuals as the expert of alcoholic beverages from around the world. He wrote some really interesting books on the history of drinks, including wine, whiskey, beer, spirit, to name but a few, which demonstrates his encyclopedic knowledge of world drinks. He was asked to write something on Japanese drink, or more specifically the drink that we can see as the unique produce of Japan. So he decided to write a small book on Japanese sake in the 1960s. This book was later published again in 2007 as a part of the book series called Iwanami Bunko. Now, if you want to know the intellectual history of Japan or Japanese culture, or just to know what is expected of Japanese intellectuals to know about the world, we have to know what Iwanami Bunko represents to them. So let me briefly introduce this series for BJA members. Iwanami Shoten is a famous publisher in Japan which started out as a second-hand bookstore in Kanda Jinbocho in Tokyo in 1913. And its debut as a publisher took place in 1914 when they published Natsume Soseki's Kokoro. The founder of this publisher, Iwanami Shigeo, was a very influential cultural figure in contemporary Japan, and he had working connections with the Kyoto school philosophers and many other contemporary Japanese intellectuals, including novelists, philosophers, religious leaders, and journalists, and even politicians. Once again, he started out as a small second-hand bookstore in Tokyo, but now his company is one of the most influential publishers in Japan. The series, Iwanami Bunko, was established in 1927 as a Japanese version of German Reclam edition, whose purpose is to make classical library accessible to the general public. Iwanami Shoten, in other words, started to produce pocket-sized books initially with 22 titles, including Sosaki's Kokoro, Koda Rohan's The Five Stories Pagoda, Higuchi Ichiyo's Nigorie and Takekurabe, and so on and so forth. If you're not familiar with Reclam in Germany, it will be useful to think that it is equivalent to classical libraries in Anglophone world. So Penguin Classics, Oxford World Classics, Loeb Classical Library, so on and so forth. And these are something equivalent. So if you talk to any intellectuals in Japan or anyone who is interested in Japanese culture and history in Europe, it's very likely that they have a volume of 2, if not a huge set of the Iwanami Bunko in their libraries. Sakaguchi Kenichiro's Nihon no Sake was included in this series in 2007. That is to say, most people would think about this book as one of the classics on Japanese sake. So let's talk about some interesting aspects of this book as an introduction to Japanese sake and culture. Sakaguchi starts with the book with an assumption that any civilization that has a long history tends to have a unique and beautiful drink of its own. Then he argues that Japanese sake is a kind of drink that is beautifully specific to its own culture. This point is not necessarily an exaggeration if we look at the process of making sake. I recommend BJA members to visit the websites of Kanpai and Oh My Sake for understanding this process. As you can see, both websites show that the process of brewing sake is equivalent neither to the production of wine nor to the distillation process of other drinks like whiskey, so it's not quite accurate to call sake as a rice wine in this regard, but you can clearly see this at the Kanpai's webpage. To learn more specifics of the production of sake, please make sure to visit these websites and we will put the links in the description below. Anyway, Sakaguchi, as the historian and agricultural chemist of sake, argues that Nihonshu is a consummation of both creative art and science and technology in Japan, and also that it is in rapport with nature. The process of making tasty Japanese sake requires artistic creativity, and to support that creativity, we need to have a technological advancement of the production process. But at the same time, precisely because it uses a living organism of koji fungi, natural ingredients like rice and water, all of which need to be exposed to the Japanese climate in many cases, bringing forth the final product cannot be separated from the natural elements of the world. That is to say, there is a less division between nature as over there, as a hostile other, and humans as over here trying to conquer the destructive nature through science and technology. I think we can say the same thing about wine in France. Sakaguchi seems to say in this book that Japanese sake is a human appreciation of nature as much as it is the consummation of our intellectual power to create something naturally pleasant and tasty for our human body and mind in nature. According to Sakaguchi, the structure of sake, that is to say the way in which it is made and how it's presented, is its natural born characteristics in one sense. This corresponds to the notion of culture as something given to us before each of us becomes aware of it. So the way in which we prepare an alcoholic beverage tells us something about the way we represent our way of being, or that is our culture. But the way sake is stored and enjoyed by us, or simply put, our tasting of it, depends so much on our cultural education. We have to cultivate our palate and senses so that we will be able to feel something when we drink a shot of sake that has complex taste. Sakaguchi in this sense argues that talking about the way in which Japanese sake is produced is not enough to describe its place in Japanese culture, but we have to pay attention to the way in which we have been enjoying Nihonshu, or sometimes disregarding its importance as a part of Japanese culture. Sakaguchi focuses on two most important taste distinctions of Amakuchi and Karachi in his observation of the Japanese reception of Nihonshu. These distinctions represent sweet and spicy taste. This is so basic to the Japanese description of food or culinary experiences. For instance, when we talk about curry, which Japanese people love so much that they ended up re-importing its own version to India recently, we have Amakuchi, which means mild, and Karachi, that is spicy. It's a bit more complicated to draw this distinction over the other things in Japanese food. Think about two instances. When you eat a red chili pepper, it's spicy. But when you eat too much wasabi, we also say it's spicy, right? But they are quite different from each other. Different kinds of spicy. The same goes for Japanese term karai or karakuchi. It has some layers. It becomes even more complicated to apply this distinction of sweet and spicy to Nihonshu, and I'm hoping that we can ask the sommeliers about how we should understand them in the context of drinking sake. At any rate, Sakaguchi is right to point out that this binary division of Amakuchi and Karachi is the first step towards our descriptive and appreciation of Japanese sake. Now, there are a number of various taste descriptions that people usually use for talking about sake. Sometimes they say it has some depth, some volume, width, redundancy, rawness, or sometimes they even describe some sake as being sad or lonely. It's almost like talking about a person or the way she or he communicates to us, or perhaps this is almost like describing a poetry. But two tastes, Amakuchi and Karachi, seem to be the basic categories to talk about all of them before getting into these fine descriptions. Sakaguchi argues that consumers' appreciation of these two tastes reflect the time in which they live their lives too. So in peaceful time, people prefer Karachi, spicy sake, while in a time of crisis and war, they crave for sweet sake, Amakuchi. But why? Well, that is because you can't keep drinking sweet sake too long. If you do so, it could make you feel sick, as you might have experienced from drinking too much sweet alcohol, or that they make you feel you had enough, just kind of fill your stomach fast. On the contrary, the spicy sake tends to keep you on the edge, and you don't get tired of it so soon. So in time of peace, we have both time and resources to enjoy sake in abundance, while in the time of crisis, we cannot afford having so many bottles. As a result, we got for sweet sake to console our souls. There is an interesting survey to back this argument in Japan. During the World War I and World War II, Amakuchi was much more popular than Karachi. But generally speaking, from the time of Meiji Restoration, the Japanese sensitivity moved from the spicy to the sweet in the middle of the 20th century. And towards the end of it, which was after the book was published, we probably moved much more towards Karachi during the economic miracle. But that's my educated guess. Then we do have to wonder how the beginning of 21st century has affected Japanese people's appreciation of the Japanese sake. Now, if we think about the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and a recent pandemic, we cannot help but think that people in Japan are moving towards Amakuchi. Or perhaps the lack of war still affords Japanese nation with the luxury of continuously drinking Karachi? This is something that we have to ask Japanese people next time when we have a chance to meet them at bars or restaurants. We can also ask the sommeliers in Belgium online in the next episode. Now the sake goes through rapid change in its style because unlike wine or whiskey, when one batch is produced, it should be in principle consumed within that year. And depending on the harvest of rice, water, climate, consumers' needs, etc., the same production system can make something quite different in the following year. Also because of this model of immediate consumption after production, the Industrial Revolution did not modernize the process of making sake to the same extent as the other industries. So in a way, the production of Japanese sake has managed to remain more or less traditional, and its connection with the Japanese culture seems to have remained much stronger. Don't get me wrong though, there are mass-produced sake, some of which we should not serve our important guests with, but there is a variety of quality Nihonshu in Japan. Just like real beers in Belgium, Also, according to Sakaguchi, the whole modernization process, which was pretty much the process of westernization at one point in modern Japanese history, pulled people away from all things Japanese in modern Japan and pushed them towards all things Western or European or North American, which contributed to this image of Japanese sake as something that is really Japanese, like old Japan. In that process of modernization, of course, Japanese sake was considered to be old-fashioned and obsolete among younger and a more modernized population. But then, we always come back to reconsider our hasty judgment in every culture, right? Some part of the youth will grow old to realize that not all of Western wine is better than Japanese sake, which they previously thought as the inferior drink to the Western products. That's usually the story about anything traditional or classic like music and philosophy, right? Interestingly, this swing between moving towards and away from Nihonshu in modern Japan has more or less shaped a contemporary production of Japanese sake itself. That is to say, we now have the division between traditional making of sake that uses only rice, water, and koji, and even observes the old regiments of production process including tools and rituals, and then all year-round factory production with the shiny tanks and machines typical of modern Japan. The former has a stronger remnants of cultural heritage, but the factory production is not necessarily negative to this traditional image either. That is because some sake makers have been making amazing quality lineups that are indistinguishable from product that is made in the traditional fashion. Of course, the modernization process does introduce mass production and consumption, which often leads to the decline of quality and craftsmanship. But the point is that every production reflects the receptivity of the Japanese customers. It seems that many of them now are looking for the high-quality Japanese sake in a traditional label rather than boxed in a mass production consumption format. Right? So box wine, box sake, it's not something to be proud of as a part of their culture. So they go for more traditional label as a viable option at their dinner parties. There are a number of famous styles in the production of sake, and it's usually tied to cultural geography. Two famous ones are called Nada-ryu and Fushimi-ryu. Nada region is located in the Osaka Bay Area, stretching from East Kobe to Imazu. So that would be located right in between Kobe and Osaka. Fushimi is a district in Kyoto, famous for Fushimi Inari Taisha, the Shinto shrine with the famous Senbon Torii, which looks like this one. The term ryu means style. So two famous styles of sake are Nada-ryu and Fushimi-ryu. Nada-ryu is famous for 5 districts called Nada-gogo. They are responsible for the 30% of the entire national production of Japanese sake. Hakutsuru and Kikumasamune are the famous makers among them. Fushimi has some archaeological findings that date back to the 5th century, which suggests that the technology of producing alcoholic drinks was imported from the continent to this region. And the archaeological findings and written records show that the Fushimi production of Nihonshu has always been with the history of Japan. Sakaguchi argues that these two styles are equivalent to the distinction between Bordeaux and Bourgogne in a French wine. First, I thought it was a bit of a wild analogy, but more read about the history of Japanese sake, and the more documentaries on Nihonshu and French wine you watch, the more convincing this analogy becomes. Because different regions in Japan can produce different types of rice and water under different types of climate, we naturally end up with many different styles of Japanese sake. Once again, the analogy with French wine works well here, since there are more regions than Bordeaux and Burgundy for the wine production in France. I'm hoping to hear more about these two famous styles of Nihonshu from the sommeliers, and also other styles that they would recommend for us to enjoy in Europe. Of course, the history of sake and the history of Japan go hand in hand. There are 3 famous shrines that are deeply related to the production of Japanese sake in Nara and Kyoto. The oldest extant collection of Japanese poetry, compiled in the second half of the 8th century in the Nara period, is called Manyoshu. The Nihonshu has many poems that talk about sake and its connection with emotions. The famous monk from the Kamakura period, Nichiren, for instance, is known for his love of Nihonshu. And he half-jokingly talks about how morally culpable it is to serve a cup of old and sour sake to your guests. As you can imagine, there is something really Japanese or old and traditional Japan about the presence of Nihonshu in life, and that is probably why Japanese people in modern times or young people today are generally prone to prefer other drinks to sake or Nihonshu for one reason or another. And they might stay away from Nihonshu as presenting the obsolete styles of drinking. But I do feel things are changing. Because Japanese sake is no longer retelling the history of Japanese people to themselves, nor does it confine them to their recurring emotions inside Japan, as Nihonshu is distributed outside of Japan and receives honest evaluations from the world beyond Japan, the Japanese people's understanding of Nihonshu will have to break out of the self-circling narrative about their cultural heritage. Also, they have to start thinking about Japanese sake in a new light as they drink a glass of it with many people from around the world. Eventually, like wine, it will have to be produced outside Japan in the future, and the notion of Japanese in Nihonshu will have to go through some change in its meaning. That is something we should think about as we drink sake at the multicultural setting of the BJA. And we are curious to hear what the sommeliers have to say about their love of Japanese sake as the instigators of this internationalization of Nihonshu in Belgium. In Japanese, there is an expression, sake no sakana ni suru. It literally means to make something into a side dish for drinking sake. And it does not have to be food or could be any kind of entertainment or topics. I hope this episode will serve as sake no sakana in that sense. And thank you for watching this video and see you next time.